Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Моє ім'я Наталка Гуменюк. І зі мною тут
Ангеліна Керякіна. Привіт!
І це розмова, яка, звісно, виникла, тому що вона не могла в нас не виникнути. Вона про Сирію і ті зміни, які сталися після блискавичного падіння режиму Башара аль-Асада. Ця родина правила Сірією 53 роки, здається.
54.
От буквально ми стали свідками, не чекали. Розкажи, з ким ти говорила, про що ця розмова?
У нас, звісно, був не один варіант. У нас є хороші контакти з сирійськими колегами, але, ти знаєш, це теж показово. Багато хто з них от прямо зараз просто неймовірно зайнятий, тому що вони реально зайняті зміною влади в Сирії, і вони постійно на якихось зустрічах, координаційних нарадах. І говорила я з Мазеном Гаріба, це сирійський дослідник, нині він дослідник Лондонської школи економіки, але він має бекграунд громадського активіста, він родом з міста Хомс, з якого він був змушений виїхати ще 2011 року. Там мережа активістів, в якій він був задіяний, була викрита. Його колеги і друзі, деякі з них заарештували і в такий спосіб викрили цю мережу. І він був змушений виїхати там спочатку в сусідні країни, потім в Європу і зрештою опинився у Великій Британії. Він приїжджав до України разом з делегацією сирійського громадянського суспільства рік тому, і ми бачилися. Поміж інших зустрічей була зустріч, в цій делегації були сирійські лікарі з лікарями з Маріуполя, славнозвісної лікарні обласної Маріупольської, яка рятувала, зокрема, вагітних жінок з розбомбленого пологового. Це лікарі, про яких в тому числі у фільмі «Чорнова і малолетки. 20 днів в Маріуполі» теж багато розказано. І от він був присутній на цій зустрічі, і я запам'ятала, як він дуже емоційно звертався до маріупольських лікарів, дякував їм за їхню роботу і говорив про те, наскільки у нього було таке враження. Він потім переповідав, що вони між собою розмовляли в автобусі про це, коли поверталися, що тільки українці можуть зрозуміти сирійців, через що проходить Сирія, тільки ми можемо достатньо глибоко зрозуміти їхню ситуацію. Ну і, власне, з Мазеном ми говорили про те, що зараз відбувається. І фокус нашої розмови не зовсім про те, як це стало можливим, ця зміна влади і повалення режиму. Вона радше про те, що от зараз, сьогодні, сирійське громадянське суспільство, яке десятки років боролося з цим режимом Асадів, раптом опинилося в ситуації, де потрібно боротися за владу, тому що тимчасова влада в Сирії – це група ісламістська з далеко не продемократичним бекграундом і не секулярним, тобто не світським бекграундом. Мазен розповідав мені, мене це найбільше просто цікавило, а що їм тепер робити? Опозиції сирійській, громадянським активістам, які опинилися по всьому світу розкидані, що вони тепер роблять і як вони будуть повертати собі країну, за яку вони не просто боролися, в боротьбі за яку було втрачено стільки життів. Просто я би хотіла цю цифру зараз в підводці озвучити. Ти знаєш, він коли говорив про ці цифри, я їх не перевіряла, я достатньо йому довіряю, але це просто порядок цифр. От тільки послухай, зниклих безвісті більше 130 тисяч зниклих безвісті. Тобто, скоріш за все, це люди, які загинули. І загинули в тюрмах, от таких, як ця Седная. Ми бачили всі кадри, як туди в цю в'язницю асадівську проривалися вже звичайні люди в пошуках своїх рідних. Більше 700 тисяч загиблих, мільйони біженців. Тобто це величезна країна, складна країна. І от результати правління Асадів. Тому, мені було цікаво в першу чергу, що тепер зараз відбувається з громадянським суспільством, що буде далі. Напевно, тільки наш досвід війни Росії проти України і того факту, що багато українців були змушені виїхати з України, в тому числі ті люди, які були змушені виїхати через окупацію, змогло сформулювати якісь такі, дуже зрозумілі питання для мене стосовно того, а як тепер бути, якщо ти там не в своїй країні? От як ти можеш боротися за цю країну, не будучи там? Які інструменти є в твоїх руках? І ми про це, мені здається, дуже цікаво поговорили.
Я думаю, що це в розмові є, але поясни коротко. Я так розумію, в багатьох з сирійців в них немає більше сирійського громадянства, вони були позбавлені своїх паспортів, втратили, набувають якогось іншого, десь просто не мають потрібних документів, і це одна з багатьох причин, чому їм дуже складно деяким людям от просто взяти сьогодні і поїхати в Дамаск, як це роблять журналісти міжнародних телеканалів.
Абсолютно. В багатьох з них, а це, от уяви, наприклад, Мазен, це там 13 років життя за кордоном. В багатьох з них немає елементарно документів, за якими вони могли би виїхати. От вони як біженці, наприклад, там не отримали громадянства або посвідки на проживання іншої країни. Вони нікуди не можуть поїхати. Там проблеми зі старими сирійськими документами. Вони трохи в такій правовій пастці опинилися. Тому це не так просто. Плюс всі розуміють, що багато хто, звісно, вже інтегрувався в якесь життя, народились діти, або діти пішли в дитсадки, в школи, люди працюють на роботах, живуть, в них є якесь житло. Тобто все не все так просто. Але є велика частина сирійців, яка все ж таки повертається додому. Це в першу чергу сирійці, які живуть в сусідніх країнах, а також ті сирійці, які були змушені жити на тому достатньо невеликій території, яку не контролював Асад. Вони не могли повернутися в Дамаск, вони не могли там приїхати в інші міста, а зараз вони можуть туди повернутися. Те, на чому він наголошує, що все-таки сирійське життя – це не вакуум, в якому немає громадянського суспільства. Він каже, що зараз з підпілля виходять активісти, опозиція, і тобто це не пуста країна, з якої абсолютно всі працездатні опозиціонери, так, і громадянські активісти виїхали. Не так, але звісно, що цвіт цієї опозиції і громадянського активу переважно весь за кордоном.
Я не хочу сказати, я там спілкуємося з багатьма людьми, читаємо новини. І я читала такі думки, коли там деякі журналісти, активісти кажуть, Боже, та зрозуміло, що все буде складно, зрозуміло, що є якісь ризики, але дайте хоча б один якийсь момент відчути, що відбулося, десь порадіти. Я пам'ятаю, колись, приведу іншу аналогію, хтось з українських військових писав, коли звільнили одне з міст, і було багато там повідомлень в той же самий день і запитань, а що буде далі, а чи утримують місто, а чи там ми знайдемо те чи інше. Він каже, в нас так багато всього поганого відбувається. Дайте один день порадіти і сказати про якісь успіхи, а не просто там бути стурбованими майбутнім. Який загалом у Мазена, за твоїми відчуттями, настрій?
Ти знаєш, ми говорили вже на який там 10-й чи 11-й день після повалення режиму офіційного. Тобто перші все-таки ці емоції вже віджили. Все одно, попри те, що попереду велика і складна робота, і вони вже всередині цієї роботи, тобто вони вже нею займаються. Все одно видно, що в них багато надій. Вона в них взагалі з'явилась, раніше не було такої надії. Що вони налаштовані на роботу, вони дуже-дуже з великою надією дивляться на майбутнє Сирії, попри те, що в них багато застережень, звісно. І не просто так, це застереження стосовно тієї влади, яка прийшла, яка повалила режим, яка зараз панує в Сирії. Але мені здається, що ця хвиля неймовірної радості, я маю на увазі те, у що складно повірити, вона досі присутня. Це відчувається, що вони досі дуже радіють. І ти знаєш, напевно, ще прийшов такий момент, я от згадала, тобто Мазен згадав про ці цифри, я їх назвала слідом за ним. Звісно, що вони в цей момент не можуть не думати про тих, хто не дожив до цього моменту. Тому це ще і така сумна радість за тих, хто боровся, але не зміг побачити цей момент, на жаль.
Дякую за цю розмову і будемо слухати наш епізод подкасту Ліни Карякіної з Мазеном Гарібою, дослідником конфліктів, сирійським громадянським активістом.
Mazen, thank you so much for talking to us, for finding time. I know you are pretty busy these days, which is a good thing, I hope. I'm not asking you about the emotions, which everyone has and everyone is asking. But what is actually happening in your hometown, in Homs? I mean, how things look like for average Syrians? What has changed over these past more than a week?
There is, I would say, in my hometown Homs, I'm from the city of Homs, which is in the middle of Syria. I think it's very similar to many other cities, but also Homs has kind of a unique demographic composition, which is also worrying. So let's start from what happened 10, 11 days ago, when the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HDS-led military command or military forces went to the city. Most of the civilians, if not all civilians in Homs, they were really hoping there will be no battle at the city. So they were really hoping that the army, the national army, would withdraw from the city, because they know that the national army has completely collapsed since the beginning of this campaign. So they were hoping that kind of a peaceful, some sort of an agreement without a fight would take place. When that happened, most people were relieved that the city hasn't witnessed any battles. Now, why people were worried specifically in Homs? Homs has a different religious and sectarian groups living next to each other. So in Homs, you have the Sunni Muslims, you have Christians, and you have Alawites. And Alawites are accused, of course, of being kind of pro-regime. Whether that's true or not, I don't believe that's the case. Of course, that's not the case, but that's kind of a very complicated issue right now. But there is this generalization that all Alawites kind of are pro-regime or regime enthusiasts. So people were worried that some sort of sectarian violence might erupt in the city if there was a battle, if there was a kind of a confrontation between the national army or the regime's army and HTS. Thankfully, that didn't happen. So the army withdrew from the city. They just all left because the army collapsed a week before that battle. They had absolutely no way of fighting, and to be honest, no morale. Also here, we have to understand that the Syrian army is a conscription army. So a lot of the soldiers, they don't want to fight. They were young people who were kind of taken from checkpoints or weren't able to flee the country. And they were thrown at the army in a war that they don't want to fight. And that actually was one of the reasons why the army collapsed quickly. Because when there was absolutely no kind of aerial support or any sort of military support from Damascus, from other brigades, soldiers, they don't want to fight. They want to go back to their villages, their hometowns, to be there with their families, to protect their families, to protect their land. So they withdrew entirely from the city. Thankfully, we haven't yet any kind of widespread sectarian violence in the city of Homs. But of course, we know that the sectarian dynamics in the city is very toxic, and this city is very, very sensitive. So that's why we're, as civil society and some of the elders and community leaders inside the city, we're trying to calm things down, trying to communicate with different groups, trying to also create this kind of intercommunal communication. But that's happening at kind of a grassroots level, at kind of a community level. Some of the Alawites went back to the city over the past couple of days to their homes and to their neighborhoods, which is good, which is a relief. But still, there is this kind of anger amongst people, right? There's this kind of unfinished, some sort of an open wounds for many, many people in Homs and elsewhere. That's why also we want people are pushing to see some sort of a transitional justice mechanisms immediately, some sort of justice for the victims, justice for the detainees, the people who were killed by either the regime's army or the regime's militias, which we call them shabiha. Shabiha basically means the ghosts. So the shabiha are kind of the regime's militias, not part of the regular army, but kind of paramilitary groups who really terrorized cities like Homs. People are hoping to see some sort of justice really soon. But for now, community leaders, civil society actors, inside the city, they're trying to calm things down and to create a sense of calm and relative stability, which I think good. So my parents still live there. I talk to them every day, and well, they're telling me that things so far are good. They haven't seen any sort of military groups walking around or kind of taking houses or any of that. People generally in Homs and elsewhere, they're very happy. There's this overwhelming joy and relief that we get rid of al-Assad's regime. My father called me in tears, saying that he thought he's going to die without seeing the fall of the Assad's family, which ruled Syria for 54 years. We all have this kind of overwhelming joy of seeing the fall of Assad finally, the brutality of Assad and all of that. But underneath that joy, people are scared. People are worried about what's going to happen next. Now we have an HTS-imposed government in Damascus. Yes, they've been sending some positive reassurances messages, which is good, they haven't seen any sort of vengeful messages from the HTS-imposed government or the interim government in Damascus, which is good. But people also worried about the sustainability of these reassurances and the continuity of these reassurances without safeguarding mechanisms, without constitutional safeguarding mechanisms to be in place, without an actual kind of inclusive political process, which we haven't seen so far. So that's also what is worrying a lot of people in Homs and elsewhere. People want to see an inclusive political process. They want to see not just Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, not just HTS on the table. They want to see other kind of representative from different groups, from different ethnicities, from different minorities, from women, civil voices, democratic voices, to be also on the table, to be part of that political process. We haven't seen that yet. And that is also worrying a lot of people. They understand that the focus now is on stability and the continuity of the state institutions. And I believe that's absolutely necessary to shift your focus on rebuilding state institutions and continuing, working in schools, in mills, and any kind of civil servants to go back to their positions and all of that. That's very important for the stability and for the sense of calm. But also people want to see an inclusive process, a political process that would include them and include their voices.
So the demands and the expectations from, let's say, 2012, of course, they didn't vanish, they didn't go away. On the contrary, people have sacrificed so much, to see that coming. So it's not only the fall of the al-Assad regime, it's also doing what the state was supposed to do more than 10, 12 years ago, right? But could you please explain, because, people don't really understand all these things in details, in specificities. For example, if you want to go back to Syria, people like you from the civil society, people who didn't have an opportunity to see their loved ones for many, many years. Is it possible now, even physically, to go back to the cities like Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, and not be afraid of, you tell me what?
So, like any other thing in Syria, even this question is very, very complicated, and there's no kind of one straightforward answer to it. So, people who are living inside of Syria, so the internally displaced people, including internally displaced civil society actors, who were kind of living in northwest of Syria, which is an area that was outside of the regime's control for over 10 years. A lot of these people, including, of course, civil activists, are going back to the cities, to the villages, to see their parents, to see their loved ones. And a lot of them actually are going back to their original places in order to create a presence, right? To say that we're here, we'll be here, we will do something here, and our civic voices is here. So people are worried about the civic spaces in Syria now. So that's why a lot of people in northwest Syria are going back to their areas, to Aleppo, Damascus, Homs, and all that. Now, refugees in neighboring countries, in Turkey and Lebanon, specifically in Lebanon, when they don't really have any sort of legal protection. To be honest, the anti-Syrian rhetorics in Turkey and Lebanon over the past years have really increased. There are a lot of racist incidents on a daily basis. So Syrians in Lebanon and in southern Turkey, a lot of them are going back to Syria because most of them don't have any legal documentations, and they just want to go back to their areas where they feel perhaps more safer than Lebanon. in that case. So also these people include a lot of civil society actors are also going back with them. Now, when we talk about refugees, Syrian refugees outside of kind of in Europe and in UK and others, and other kind of remote places, things get more complicated here. Civil society activists who have the proper documentation to go back are going back, either to visit, to kind of assess the situation, and some of them are willing to resettle back to Syria. Most of these people, they already kind of got their dual citizenship, or they have kind of long residencies in Europe and elsewhere, and they're able to go back. But for a lot of us, including myself, that's a problem, because we've been exiled for 14 years and we've also been working on Syria all this time. But throughout these 14 years, a lot of us still have refugee status. A lot of us have no proper documentations yet to move around or to travel anywhere. A lot of us, they kind of built their lives over this kind of 14 years. They had kids, sent them to schools, have jobs. You know, they kind of integrated within their new societies, within Germany, in the UK, in France, and all of that. And all of us planning to go back. We want to go back, but it's not easy for a lot of people with families, people with jobs, and all of that. There are a lot of logistical, kind of also legal considerations or requirements to take into consideration. Some people are concerned about the safety or the spaces that might exist now in Syria. That's why we're saying people, if you are willing, if you have the proper documentation, if you of course kind of willing to go back or to visit or to support, people should do that, of course, if they choose to do so, because we are afraid that the civic space that currently exists after the fall of the regime, because now everything is kind of free falling, might not exist for a long time. So we need to protect that space. There's this idea circulating amongst us that if you can go back and just kind of hold on to some spaces that's now opening, we should do that.
The most active, proactive, intelligent, brave, people were forced to move out. And those who have been working on Syria for so many years were out, considering that Syria really needs all those people. I mean, what do you do in this situation like that? You know, having all these legal troubles and everything, I can imagine there are so many complications. But just for all of us to understand, I can also imagine Syria is a big country with many different groups. It's a complicated country. There's nothing like, one civil society, like one group, calling each other, having Zoom meetings on a daily basis, something like that. I can imagine there are many, many absolutely factions and groups and organizations. But is there kind of a platform where you guys, have an opportunity to communicate and coordinate, and if it's safe also to explain to us, just to understand where you have an opportunity to influence what is happening in Syria now?
So there are many platforms and coalitions amongst civil society organizations inside and outside Syria that were built over the past 10 years. And as you said, all of these kind of coalitions, platforms, networks are kind of gathering, meeting on a daily basis, either through Zoom or now with also people from these platforms and coalitions who were able to go back to some of these areas. So yes, civil society is engaging with each other. There are a lot of communication. It's still very chaotic, to be honest. We still kind of haven't figured out, okay, so what's going to happen now? What should we be doing? Specifically, that people also need to understand that this is the fall of the Syrian, the Assad's family is not just the past 14 years. Assad's family has been ruling Syria for the past 54 years. The collapse of such an authoritarian, security-led regime is not easy. It will take, in my opinion, decades actually to be able to transform Syria into democracy, into what we are hoping to see, kind of a democratization in Syria. So a lot of platforms exist, a lot of meetings are currently happening. However, there is this worry among civil society organizations, all of them, but in particular the kind of pro-democracy civil activists like myself, for instance, and many, many, many others, about how influential are we right now. There is an HTS-imposed political process, which is, to be honest, is for us it's not very positive because you have an armed group, regardless of their kind of ideological preferences, which is also important here. But for me, you have an armed group leading a political transition. That's not a good sign. That's why a lot of civil society organizations and activists are pushing for a UN-facilitated political process in order to at least ensure the inclusivity of that process, to ensure that women, pro-democracy voices, secular voices, human rights activists, feminist activists, different kind of groups representative of Kurds, of different ethnicities, of Christians, of Alawites, of Muslims, of kind of all of this groups to be represented in a political process.
Your contact is the international institutions like the UN. You are contacting with the UN, not with the HTS directly.
Both of these kind of communications are happening. You have, of course, this engagement with the UN to facilitate a Syrian-led process, in collaboration with HTS, because you cannot just also ignore them or exclude them. They have to be part of that. So there is this kind of path. There is another path is taken by other kind of civil society actors, which I think it's good as well, is engaging directly with them, is trying to exert some pressure on them from the inside. And I think these two paths, they complement each other. They're not mutually exclusive, because we're not saying that we don't want to put them in a corner or give them any kind of ultimatum. So far, they've been showing some positive signs. We don't want them to be hostile or aggressive. So we're trying to bargain with them from different paths. So as I said, there's a bargaining with the UN, through the UN, with them. And there's also bargaining happening, kind of soft kind of bargaining happening with them directly inside Syria.
Are there any signs that HTS, probably maybe they made any direct statements about that, but are they willing to have first the elections, right? Something that everyone in Syria is expecting and haven't seen for decades, fair elections, transparent. And secondly, do you see any signs that they are ready for this inclusivity of which you are talking?
That's the problem. So they're saying they're saying that they want to have a comprehensive Syrian-led process. And they hint to kind of elections and all of that. But that's not enough, because we haven't seen any sort of a political plan, any political transitional plan, any sort of a political objectives, timeline, framework of action. All of these are still missing. So it's just, at this moment, kind of discursive politics. It's just kind of speeches and rhetorics that, yes, we want a comprehensive process. Okay, what does it mean? When you say comprehensive process, who's leading that process? Who's selecting? Who's identifying which are the representative bodies to be on the table? What kind of discussions are we talking about? They hinted on elections, but they haven't been engaged in any serious conversation about the governance of these elections. What is most worrying for me is the discussion about the constitution. So they're saying that till this moment, they're saying we want to amend the current constitution by appointing something like a technical constitutional committee. And that's also very worrying for me, because the constitution should not be appointed or dictated by an armed group. That's why we're fixating on the inclusive process, because we want to have a civilian-led transitional governing body, some sort of like a national congress of some sort, that is responsible for drafting a new constitution. Then at least you know that there's some sort of a different voices and different demands in that constitution. So far, that's not the case. So far, they're saying we will have a new constitution, we will amend the current constitution, and we will have technocrats working on that. That is scary for me, because it seems that so far, they're not willing to do any kind of power sharing with other voices, or they might be willing to do so, but with voices that perhaps agree with them, or voices can perhaps maybe more sympathetic with them, or voices kind of not very far from them, or kind of orbiting around them. And that's scary for many of us.
What's the problem with the constitution? If you could explain just simply for those who know nothing about it.
Even if you have the best constitution in the world, but then you have an Assad's regime in power, that the constitution has no meaning. So in Syria, we had the problem of course, this kind of brutal authoritarianism of Bashar al-Assad. And of course, we also had kind of a short-sighted, crippled constitution. So for instance, the Syrian constitution that was changed in 2012, during the era where Bashar al-Assad wanted to be seen as a reformist. After the uprising of 2011, Bashar al-Assad wanted to be seen by the West as someone who was dealing with the demands. So they changed the constitution, the previous one. The previous one was, we call it the 70s constitution, which the 8th article of that constitution says a Ba'ath party is the leader of state and society. That was in the infamous 8th article of the 1973 constitution. And you can imagine the rest of the articles if you have this one. Yeah, after the uprising of 2011, 2012, Bashar al-Assad appointed a constitutional committee and they changed some of the language of that constitution. So they, for instance, omitted this article and they said, well, Syria is kind of multi-party system and we have elections and all of that. But they kept a lot of other articles that will give absolute power to the executive, to the presidents, really. So in the current constitution, the president has almost kind of a godlike power over everything. So the president can appoint constitutional courts and dismantle them. The president can dismantle the People's Assembly, which is the parliament, at any time. The president has legislative power, so the president can also issue laws and regulations. The president appoints governors. They directly kind of report to the president. Of course, the president is the leader of the army and forces and all of that. So the president in the Syrian constitution has all the possible powers with absolutely no accountability measures for the president. The only court that could hold the president accountable is the constitutional court, which is appointed by the president. So that's one of the problems in the Syrian constitution. Also, the Syrian constitution doesn't recognize a lot of ethnicities in Syria. So, for instance, the Syrian constitution called the Syria, the official name of Syria is the Syrian Arab Republic. But not all Syrians are Arabs. We have lots of Kurds, Syriacs, Armenians, Assyrians, a lot of different ethnicities and different languages and inside the country. But the constitution doesn't recognize that. We're all Arabs, which is not the case. We're not all Arabs, but it doesn't recognize the kind of multi-ethnic community, their civil rights or any kind of right for that. Also, the constitution is needless to say, doesn't give any sort of kind of gender equality, doesn't ensure any sort of gender equality, such as like women representation or women quotas in elected bodies and all of that. So many other kind of problems with how the constitution deals with health, education, other kind of services. These are kind of few issues of the Syrian constitution. And that's why we've been working so hard over the years to create kind of an alternative constitution, a more inclusive constitution that basically redefines Syria as a republic that is for all, as a republic that recognizes everyone's language, ethnicity, religion, give civil and political rights on the basis of equal citizenship between men and women, because there are a lot of differences. The Syrian constitution and the Syrian law is very exclusive or kind of exclusionary to women. So, for instance, Syrian women cannot give their citizenship to their children. Only men can do that. Syrian women can do that in very, very specific kind of conditional circumstances, but it's not a right for Syrian women to do this. And the constitution itself is not written in a neutral language. So when you look at for instance, the sections and the articles about the elections and the presidency and all of that, they refer to the president of the presidency as him, as a male.
Is there a draft already? Yes.
There are many drafts, many visions, constitutional drafts, but yes, we do have that. We worked very hard on this to have this kind of inclusive, equal citizenship constitution that also kind of give some sort of political decentralization to different Syrian groups, like the Kurds and all the Syrian and elsewhere. Of course, a lot of us are trying to find a way and kind of venue to communicate this to HTS, but let's be realistic. Do we believe that HTS really believe in gender equality or any sort of inclusive government and kind of accountability for all and equal rights for Or we don't know. We don't think so.
If they don't, and they come from a background which says the opposite, if they don't, is there a plan for you, or is the plan is making them do what they're supposed to do?
That's a good question. That's why we were talking for non-stop for a week now. As I said, one of the plan is also to kind of, as I said, bargaining with them, trying to find kind of a middle ground with them. The other way is also to go through with other kind of influential powers, kind of the UN and others, also to say, look, guys, you've been doing positive things so far, specifically with regards to the continuity of state institutions and services and so on, but we want to see more. Because also let's remember that Syria is still under sanctions, very strict sanctions, and HTS is still listed as kind of still a conscripted group. I think it's also for their own benefits. They should be seen as giving political concessions, meaningful political concessions to the international community.
But Mazen, I wonder how many concessions do they have to make, and with whom, being present in Syria? I mean, I can imagine how much of the opposition, and the civil society is outside Syria, with all these complicated circumstances, with many of you not able to come back to Syria and to face them, as these things are happening. And I can imagine, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's not so much opposition and civil society in Syria right now that they have to really consider physically how the Syrian society right now in Syria physically looks like.
That's a good question. So Syria is not a void when it comes to civil society. Even in Damascus, even under the brutal rule of Bashar al-Assad, there were a lot of underground hidden civil society actors and activists, and now they are finally able to breathe. What is giving me hope and what is kind of creating this sense of maybe we're not going to see any serious move toward the democratization on the short term, but on the long term, what giving me hope is seeing the Syrian squares on Friday, the celebration of the fall of Assad. It felt like Syrians reclaimed their squares and streets and kind of reclaimed their voice and agency. That gives me hope that it's not easy to take that back from them. I mean, when we started demonstrating in 2011, I was still in Homs. We had nothing. We had no civil society organizations, no international media, no independent media. We absolutely had nothing. We were kind of enthusiastic, maybe crazy young men and women just storming the streets. And we had absolutely nothing. Now, things are different after 14 years. Now, the new generation, they have us, they have civil society organizations, they have independent media, they have the know-hows, they have the kind of discussions about the constitution, about politics. There've been now I've received a lot of invitations about creating and establishing political parties inside Syria and all of that. So that gives me hope that there is this vibrant civil society that now emerging in Syria. It's emerged elsewhere. It's emerged in the diaspora and in neighboring countries supporting people inside Syria. But now this kind of in the in-country civil society is vibrating. For me, that is my guarantee for the future. That maybe not in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 10 years, we might see democratization, actual inclusiveness of all Syrian. As I said, that would take a long time. For us now, people outside of Syria and people who are willing to go back to Syria, wanting to and we're trying to hold on to these civic spaces in order to increase our bargaining power with the current authority. How much power do we have? I don't know.
But even small power is better than none at all.
Exactly.
Making parallels is not so easy. But again, I can imagine, at one time, following the regime of Putin and us facing a situation in which, the temporarily occupied territories are back under Ukrainian control. And with all of that, how much work should be done in order to be ready for this day to come. So when the day comes, you already have something. This is why it's also interesting how much is there for you in place after 50 years, of ruling of the Assad's regimes. One of your
probably friends and colleagues, Hamza al-Khatib told me, until this day we didn't have any hope, and now at least we have hope.
Yes, and hope is a very powerful weapon. And people are hopeful. I am myself hopeful. Maybe a lot of us are still trying to figure out, because we've really worked hard over the past 14 years for the day after. So as I said, we have a vision for the constitution, of a security sector reform, of what should be done in the agriculture sector, in the private business sector, and all of that. And we want a venue to put these ideas and to discuss these ideas and all of that. And we're trying hard to create these kind of venues of bargaining. So far, unfortunately, that's not the case yet. Civil society hasn't been kind of invited to sit at the table and to say, look, guys, you've been working so hard over the 14 years. You accumulated a lot of knowledge. So let's use that knowledge for the better future of our people. That hasn't been the case so far. It seems that our fight is still going on to have the civil voices heard by the authorities. But there is this sense among Syrians that whatever happens is not going to be rosy. It's not going to be straightforward. But whatever happens, there's nothing worse than living under Bashar al-Assad. And trust me, that's true. I've lived under al-Assad and under Bashar al-Assad. When we talk about the brutality of this regime, people don't believe us. People think that we're just making things up. And now people are saying detainees and saying secret prisons and what's happening in Syria, in Sednaya prison and other areas. People are now hearing about chemical weapons and barrel bombs and all of that. This is the reality of living under Assad. And what gives me hope is that probably not going to see that ever again in Syria. We might end up with an authoritarian, autocratic kind of regime, but without Sednaya prison, without chemical weapons, without the fear of death at every moment in your life. And that gives me hope in a way that change will take a long time. We were hoping that in the day after Bashar al-Assad, civil society will be on the table and the new authority will say, congratulations, guys, you did great. Let's build on the knowledge that has been accumulated over the past years. Let's build this democracy together. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We have HTS now. HTS are being pragmatic. They're very pragmatic and they will always be pragmatic. And also we're trying to tell people that their pragmatism is not from a strong place. It's actually from a weak place because they want the recognition, they want the delisting, and they want the stability. I'm 100% that they are focusing on stability and security at the time being. And it seems that it's fine for the region, but it's not just, it's also fine for us, but it doesn't end at security, at regional security and stability, right? As Syrians, we want to see democracy, we want to see political representation, we want to see voices. But it seems for our regional partners, they're willing to take security and stability over democratization at any moment. And I think that's what's happening. I'm hopeful that things will not be the same ever again. We'll not see another Bashar al-Assad. Syrians will never allow that. But it will take a long time. So the fall of Bashar al-Assad is the first step toward democratization. It's not the final step. And I think that's what a lot of us are now coming to realize, that our fight as civil society, our struggle for democracy, for election, is not over yet. It's still pretty much ongoing. But at least now we don't have a Sednaya prison to be thrown in a hole in Sednaya prison for the rest of your life. At least now you might have better bargaining power, perhaps kind of a slightly wider margin of what used to happen. And maybe that's good for the time being.
Yes, I also think it's absolutely better. And it is really hard to imagine something worse that you have been through. I mean, literally, you have been through everything imaginable. I mean, secret prisons, and and pushback against opposition is something that many faced, but, chemical weapons against your own people and aviation and everything that you've witnessed is really hard to imagine something like that. The things that you've been through are crimes. I'm thinking now, because we all are working also with the war crimes here in Ukraine, and we are very much focused on justice. I wanted to ask you how much of this demand and, a necessity for justice is on the table. I know that everyone is thinking about the future and how things should be and develop, but at the same time, there should be an answer to what has been done. Is there something, an initiative, someone like Ibrahim, who has been working with international justice, on the table right now that people are also thinking to bring those responsible to accountability?
Yes, of course. So justice and accountability is kind of also a main demand for thousands of families who came or coming now to this painful closure that their loved ones who've been waiting for years now probably not going to show up. We're talking about around 160,000 missing people in Syria. That's in addition to all the people who were killed, the 700,000 people who were killed, either directly or kind of in prisons as well. But there's 160,000 people are still missing. And their families are now, after most prisons are open, and their families are kind of now coming to this conclusion that, they're probably dead, buried in mass graves. Tens of thousands of families are kind of pushing for justice and accountability for this. And this is something the Syrian society have been really strong in advocating for. I remember when we visited Ukraine, the civil society delegation, when we visited Ukraine last year, we were in Kiev and we met with the Ukrainian civil society. And on our way back from Kiev, and we were saying to each other that I think only Ukrainians understand us. Really, they understand what we're going through, and they understand our pain, and they understand why we're seeking justice and accountability, and why we want justice for these people. So yes, there are a lot of initiatives. So there is this an idea that we've been working on for a long time with an exceptional international tribunal for the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian regime. That's something that we are willing to and we want to continue pushing for. There's also now different kind of proposals and ideas about the national courts, kind of the reform of the judicial system in Syria in order to create specialized courts for specific war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as a court for the missing people. Because when we say 160,000 people and we say that we mass graves and a lot of documents, and it will take years of searching and DNA analysis and all of that in order to be able to find an answer for some of these missing persons. One of the proposals, of course, is to have a dedicated court for the missings, a court for the use of chemical weapon, a court for the forced displacement and other issues. Syrians, if maybe we have a lot of differences about how to approach the current HTS government, but all of us kind of agree that justice and accountability is a priority for a lot of people. In order to heal, you need some sort of justice. And we're not talking about vengeful justice. That's not what most Syrians want. Sometimes even kind of a symbolic recognition of pain for a lot of people is important. For instance, I was talking to a friend of mine who sadly also came to the conclusion that her brother and father are not with us anymore. And we were talking about, okay, what do you want to see? And she said, my mom, she wants to see a national day of mourning for these missing people. That's a very sensitive topic, because when you talk to the families of the missing, it's really difficult for them to lose hope. It's really difficult for them to acknowledge that maybe some of their missings are dead. Some of them might be alive. We're hoping. Really, everyone is trying so hard to find if there is any more secret prisons that we don't know of. There are a lot of now demands from the international communities to send rescue teams to treat this as a kind of a natural disaster, like an earthquake, to try to look for mass graves. We know of several places of mass graves, so there are a lot of mass graves that we know where they are, and we're trying to protect them in order for kind of the proper processes are in place. But there are other mass graves that we have absolutely no idea where they are. One of the things, of course, is some organizations are putting financial rewards for previous regime personnel to come forward with any information they might have on mass grave, on any secret prisons. There's also a lot of discussion with the current interim government that maybe also try to have some sort of an amnesty of any former regime official who come forward with any meaningful information about mass graves and secret prisons, because people need to know what happened and need to know, as you said, the truth. And that's something that's going to take years, but I think the civil society is ready for this, and we have a lot of ideas, but whether the current de facto authority or interim government is willing to engage with that or not, that's really something for the future still. But we're pushing, we're negotiating with them, we're trying really hard to prioritize the issues of justice and accountability. For a lot of people, they will never go back to Syria if there is no justice. I know a lot of people saying, I'm not going to go back if there's no justice, if there's no courts, if there's no answers to where's my brother, where's my husband, where's my wife. So that's why it's also a priority to find answers. So some people might be able to heal. And we have to understand that a lot of people will never heal from this.
Mazen, so much work ahead, and it's such a great thing that there is hope that something of that could be done in some time, but that you can start doing something. Probably my last question to you is, I don't know when was the last time you were in Homs, but my question would be, what would you do? What would be your first thing to do when you come there?
So I left Homs by the end of 2011 when the group of activists I was working with was exposed, and some of them were detained. So I had to flee Syria. I went to Lebanon, and then my journey in the diaspora started in Turkey and Europe and now in UK. So it's been almost 13 years. To be honest, I cannot stop thinking about this. What the first I'm going to do. I know that the first thing I'm going to do is to visit my mom, of course, and then to visit the grave of my best friend, Mazen Gharibah. Mazen Gharibah was my best friend. We worked really hard together, and he was killed. He was killed by a mortar shell. He was a medic, a civilian medic, and he was trying to help people, getting them out from under the bombardments, and he was hit by a mortar shell, and he was killed. And he's buried in Homs. My first thing was, after seeing my mom, hugging my mom, is to go put flowers on Mazen's grave for these people who really sacrificed a lot for this country, and are not here with us today to maybe celebrate the fall of al-Assad and try to work for a better future. So, and I think a lot of Syrians are doing the same, seeing their loved ones and then paying tribute to our fallen comrades and friends and colleagues and family members.